Hey everybody, welcome to DevOps Tooling and Policy as a way for government modernization. I'm Will St. Clair. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect here at AWS working on our public sector team. And joining me today is Jamie Jones, Lead for Government Solutions at GitHub. So as technologists at a public sector organization or a government agency, you face a unique challenge. How do I deliver the software necessary to support my agency or organization's mission? How do I deliver this software at the required velocity? And how do I do so all while complying with the requirements of my stakeholders, my security and governance requirements, and the unique challenges that we face as public sector organizations? Meeting these challenges is a challenge. It's critically important that customers have the ability to meet those deliver software at the required velocity, and they're doing so by adopting cloud and DevOps principles. And in doing so, they're able to deliver software faster than they have been able to before, meet the security requirements to a greater extent than ever before, and in doing so, eliminate a lot of the undifferentiated heavy lifting that previously plagued some of these issues. And so many of our customers could not imagine doing this without GitHub, and that's why I'm pleased to introduce Jamie Jones, Senior Solutions Lead for Government at GitHub. Take it away.
Thank you, Will. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Hopefully this is an aspirational presentation as we look at some of the things I show, some of the things I talk about. These are things in your agencies and organizations you hope to get to. But I also hope the other part of this presentation is showing that it's not just aspirational, it's obtainable. I have a lot of screenshots. I have a lot of real-world examples, both happening at GitHub, as well as happening in the federal government today, maybe even last year. These are things that are not that far away, and these are things that are not unobtainable to you. So as we see this, as we think about where your organizations, where your agencies are in your modernization journey, I just want to be clear that this is a goal, this is an endpoint, this is a rest stop that you can make. It's not something that you can't get to, even in the government, even with compliance, even with regulation, even with workforce, even with guys like me trying to push you there. So definitely feel free to take notes, take pictures. This presentation will be available afterwards. I have a point for Q&A at the very end, but also we'll be happy to talk to you as well after the fact. So with that, let's get going. So as Will just mentioned, I'm Jamie Jones, Public Sector Solutions Lead, as well as regulated industries. I dabble a little bit with financial services for GitHub. Been with GitHub about 2 years. Before coming to GitHub, government developer, technical project manager, technical architect, went to a lot of meetings, right? I wore a lot of hats, but hopefully this comes to you with the perspective that I've been in your shoes. I've been helping with government software, been helping with government missions, I've been helping with government processes, and also dealing with government security. So I bring to you this perspective that I've been in your shoes, but we can get out of those shoes into the future together. You can find me on social media, right? I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub, not surprisingly enough. So definitely feel free to reach out in any of those venues. Real quick, I want to give a brief level set, brief introduction to GitHub for those in the room who don't know it. So maybe by show of hands, who in the room already has a GitHub account? That's the sort of thing I like to see. What, 90%? So for you, a lot of this is going to be commonplace, but you would be surprised as I start talking about what GitHub is, what GitHub does, how many people who have been maybe using GitHub for 3 or 4 years say, I didn't know you could do that. Or I didn't know you did that. Or I didn't know you didn't do that. We had someone come up to the booth yesterday who said, how long has GitHub been owned by Facebook? I said, well, that's news to me. Unless the answer is for 5 minutes, that's not the truth. So GitHub itself has been a company since about April of 2007. So we just passed our 10-year anniversary. We had our first commit to the website in October of 2007. And since then, we've grown to have over 20 million users on the platform. 59 million, almost 60 million projects hosted. And that fourth number is what is super interesting to me. Is there's 110 million pull requests currently on github.com. Closed, open, public, private. It's a lot of data, that's a lot of code, that's a lot of features and bugs that have been fixed. That bottom stat is super interesting, and I'll get back to it in just a minute. But we're the 62nd most traveled website in the entire world. That's behind like 18 versions of Google. and of course, AWS and Amazon. And like, there's a MySpace clone that's still really popular in Brazil somehow. That's like 38th. But you talk about all those websites, you talk about all that traffic, and this little old development tool, this little old software company, this little old collaboration platform is right up there with it. So as we talk about government software, as we talk about building software and modernizing going to the future, when we talk about GitHub, I hope GitHub isn't a fad, but what we've already seen is a staying power, ability to grow, and quite frankly, validation from the market that this is a good way, in my opinion, the best way to build software. When we talk about GitHub, many people think of GitHub.com, right? You think of free and public open repositories. Even the government is putting open source stuff out there. Code.gov, right? The basis of the federal source code policy out there for the open for all to see on GitHub.com. Organizations on GitHub.com right now from the likes of the Department of Defense, Department of State, FCC, EPA, even NIH, all sharing code in the free and in the open today. Teams, that's where you can build an organization and actually work on private code, things you're not sharing with the world. Many of those same organizations I just mentioned also have private presences on GitHub.com. And our newest offering on GitHub.com, which is GitHub Business Hosted, has all of the things you would get typically in Teams, but we've added some additional things like an SLA for support, an SLA for uptime, and the ability to use two-factor authentication and protect your organization from outside users. So we can hook up to your own SAML provider, whether you're running something on-prem or something in the cloud like Okta or Office 365, to actually manage the onboarding and offboarding of your users on GitHub.com. So for those, we have definitely, I've spent some time working with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. They have a large user base on GitHub.com. But one of their issues as they grow this large user base is how do we manage them? How do we add users? How do we remove users when they leave our organization? That's what GitHub Business is sort of made for, to sort of simplify those sort of processes. But this is GitHub.com. What I see mostly in the federal government is GitHub Enterprise. So imagine all the advantages, all the features, all the great things that come with GitHub.com, that really popular website, all those pull requests, wrapped up in a package in software that can run on premises or in the cloud. We have additional auditing and logging features. Again, we'll talk to today about how you can meet your compliance and auditing requirements. All of that sort of comes out of the box with GitHub Enterprise. Ability to support your own organizations, your own users, and again, your own identity providers. What do we see this being used in the government? We see people running GitHub Enterprise on AWS GovCloud, right? I want all the FISMA and FedRAMP certifications underlying my system. I want to log in with my PIV and CAC, and I want every single action that happens on the system to be authenticated with my PIV and CAC. I have compliance requirements to go to this sort of authentication, and my existing SVN, CVS, ClearCase, or in some customers' cases, their homegrown system just isn't going to support that. With GitHub Enterprise, it comes out of the box. Again, identity management for your own tools, whether it be Active Directory, Office 365, Ping Federate, or any of the other numerous tools out there, it comes working. We have a wide range of federal customers already. So maybe the next point of participation. About 90% of you raised your hand when you said you have a GitHub.com account. How many of you are using GitHub Enterprise or GitHub.com in your day-to-day workflow with the government or your education or wherever you're at? We went from about 90% to 5%. So hopefully seeing these sort of things in front of you, seeing that there are other people, seeing that we do have over 70 US federal customers everywhere from IC to DoD to civilian agencies already running GitHub will give you the ability, will let you start that conversation internally, that this is obtainable to me. One of the things we recently released in GitHub Enterprise 2.10 is the ability to do replication to run multiple instances. So you can sort of geolocate your data, your processes. So of course, you can run it starting out of US Gov East, but maybe you have another instance sort of running and replicating in US East. And maybe sometime in 2018, you have another instance replicating in US Gov East. Being able to sort of share your workload makes sense if you're GSA and you have teams in San Francisco, and you have teams in DC, and you have teams all over. But let's start talking about when you're in DoD, when you have teams on the East Coast, teams in the West Coast, and teams in Germany, and teams in East Asia. Now you can really start thinking about the power that AWS, the regions, the compliance it brings you with the replication as well. Finally, as we talk about GitHub, we have a lot of what we've mentioned, a lot of what you think of as what you do as users, right? But we have a very rich API and platform that's built off of it. Both a REST and GraphQL API, webhooks to allow other tools to integrate with GitHub, as well as GitHub apps, which is sort of that permission scheme, that management connecting tools together. Why this is important, and I said we come back to it from earlier, while we're the 62nd most traveled website in the world, we get more machine-to-machine traffic every day than we do people. So imagine that traffic number, that stat I showed earlier, is less than half of our daily traffic because the rest of it's coming from integrations, it's coming over the API. And that's the other key thing I see when talking about GitHub with the government. Teams starting this modernization journey, teams saying, well, we're using SVN today and we need to use GitHub. Well, that's a great start, but that's not where the journey ends, right? Because you already have other enterprise tools. Maybe you're using HP Fortify for static code analysis, or you're using Jenkins or Travis CI for integrations, right? Circle CI or Slack. You're using Black Duck to manage your dependency security. These are things that should be and need to be integrated with your GitHub Enterprise instance, because this is really how you're going to get a lot of the use and a lot of the visibility and transparency that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So, said we're going to talk about it a little bit later. Let's talk about transparency for a second. So, this talk is going to be a mix of what, hopefully, as a developer, as a software team, as a mission-focused organization can get out of GitHub, but also how what you're getting out of GitHub can help meet your security requirements and help make your whole organization better. So we're going to mix and match a little bit as we flow through. But my goal is at the end of the day, you see that we're building more secure software, more compliant software, and more visible software at the end of the day. So first question I always like to ask is who did what and when? We're talking a lot these days about bug bounties, ability to protect against cyber breaches, cyber security incidents. The Pentagon, Chris Lynch was up on the same stage just yesterday morning talking about Hack the Pentagon, right, and what HackerOne is doing. GSA has recently signed up for a similar program where they are going to have people coming in externally to test the security, test the credentials of their systems. So it's great once you find a vulnerability, once you find a security problem. But what do you do then? You need to know when that security problem got introduced and how big of a deal it is. So we need to ask ourselves what's really going on. Git and many common version control tools will give you an output that looks like this. Even as a developer, I don't want to see something that looks like this, right? But if I could see something that looks like this, now we're starting to really tell a different picture. We can now see the code or the documents or the integrations or the configurations and see immediately who made the changes, what they were trying to change, their commit messages when they made those changes, how old, or in some cases how stale, that code is, and an easy visualization down the side with varying colors of red to yellow to orange to green of, again, how old that code is. So comparing this to that is night and day to be able to identify what's going on. But not only are you seeing the code as it exists today, you can see how the code has existed in the past. So this is an example where we were looking at this specific constructor. You can use the UI to click back in time, to flow through to see how this specific line of code has changed. So let's again use the example if we're looking for a security vulnerability. We're looking for when this problem was introduced. You can now go back in time and see who made the change, when they made the change, and what they thought they were fixing, and eventually track back to the bug. Using the typical Git tools or Subversion tools or whatever they may be is an onerous process. Maybe you need an IDE to do it. IDEs have made this easier, but how many of our security professionals have an IDE installed on their system, right? They're operating in Microsoft Word. They're operating in SharePoint. So surfacing these tools not just to developers, but your entire team is definitely a key in sort of making software, making modern software development available to the entire team. And it's key that I say team because I don't think of software development team as just those people writing code. As we go through the rest of this presentation, we'll talk about the team, including things like 508 compliance. Again, your security testers, your project managers, your technical writers, maybe even your actual end users. So let's talk about what the GitHub workflow can capture and expose as part of your process. Some of what we're about to see here is actually the tooling that GitHub uses internally. So again, aspirational but obtainable. GitHub has a tool internally called Sentinel. Runs on our API, looks at check-ins to our code, looks at pull requests, and helps to make recommendations, security audits, and hopefully make our code better. Here's a great case where it recognized that typically when we make a change to our REST API, it's a good idea for the developers to let the REST API, the platform team, know that these changes have happened. So Sentinel goes ahead and does that for us. Hey, you're changing your REST API. You should go ahead and let these people know. These are manual processes that we realized over time we were constantly doing. So we said, let's go ahead and automate them. Ben Balter, many of you may know, former Presidential Innovation Fellow, government GitHub evangelist for many years, is now a project manager within GitHub, has a saying: if you have to answer the question more than once, you should write it down. Because at that point, this question is becoming sort of sticky. It's a real problem that's not being answered by some other process. So let's write that down. Look at what we've done with Sentinel to take that same strategy to our actual code. This is a situation where we were updating the database. So Sentinel reminds us what typically happens when we update the database. We've got some documents on deploying to the database, documents on what not to deploy to the database. So let's go ahead and surface those to our developers as they're working in real time. Let's apply this to government. Let's say I'm working at the FEC or I'm working at Census. There may be processes that are in my job that I only do every 10 years. I only do every 4 years. I only do every 2 years. Keeping that in sort of subject matter expertise in your agency is tough because you're not using it often enough. You're not repeating it for it to be a rote process that's easily done. So being able to surface that when the time is necessary, very helpful. The other key piece of that is the guy who helped with the census 10 years ago, guy or gal, may not be the person doing it now. You may have gone through 3 different vendors in that time period. So we need a way to sort of keep that institutional knowledge within your code, within your process, not in the head of your team. We talk about exposing process, automating process. How many people here were able to stop by and see my talk on Probot, on building workflows with GitHub yesterday? A couple of you. So this is an example of a Probot integration I built last week that runs on top of AWS and Red Hat's OpenShift. We looked at the process that was done for a team in their typical deployments. On every time they got a successful build, so you see the green check marks, they went ahead and they said, we're going to spin up a new set of containers and we're going to deploy to OpenShift. So I said, cool, let's write a Probot integration that does that for you. Whenever they got ready to merge, instead of just copying the files over and updating master, updating the production system, they did a canary deployment. They slowly siphoned traffic 5%, 10%, 20% off those production servers onto the servers that they were testing. This did 2 things. That allowed them to see that there were no additional errors being created, and B, it let them make sure that they could scale and manage the load on the system now that it was getting real users. This was their process, so we automated it for them. The less manual processes, the less things in the hands of humans, or the less things we have to make mistakes with. It means the less things for our testers and our QA teams to find, less things for our security teams to find, and quite honestly, the less things for our end users to find. So the more that we can automate, the more that we can build on top of these workflows, the better we'll all be. Finally, code review is documentation. We saw the news this week that Mark Schwartz, CIO of USCIS, is stepping down from his position. One of the things that his teams have done really well with GitHub Enterprise is use it to manage their code talk, their code documentation, and their actual subject matter process. I can tell you from my own personal examples, when I got ready to leave my last job with the Navy before coming with GitHub, I gave 2 months' notice because I knew it would take me almost that long to go through Excel spreadsheets that were saved on my computer, past emails, Word docs, and Post-its littered all over my office to offload that information to my team. And even then, I was still getting emails up to a month and a half later saying, how did this thing work? Or what process did you use for this? When you use pull requests, when you use these sort of flows to sort of write documentation, this is a back and forth we're seeing on the screen right now as they were talking about the best way to implement code. These are things that live beyond your teams, live beyond your actual people, and can even live beyond vendors. Right? When we're no longer locking this data into proprietary workflows or proprietary contracts and making it available to the whole team, it makes everyone better. And finally, pull requests and code review. So one of the first-class features of GitHub now is code review. You can ask for, hey, coworker, can you review this code? You can ask for teams, hey, QA team, can you review this code? Or even GitHub is rolling out the ability to kind of suggest who should review this code for you. Maybe it's the last person who touched the file. Maybe it's the last person who made a significant change to the file, or even introduced a bug to the file, because they're typically more familiar with the code than anyone else. This is an example where a developer proposed a change, but at the end of the day, it wasn't going to be scalable. It wasn't going to be maintainable. So another lead developer on the project, the one who typically actually owns this code or has done the most work, was able to flag that early. One thing studies have repeatedly shown is the earlier you can find a bug, the cheaper and easier it is to fix it. Something like 60 times more expensive to fix a bug that made it to production than to fix a bug that was found in dev. So by using things like code review, by using things like automating some of these notes, by surfacing some of these other mentions and bringing other people into the conversation, we're helping you find these bugs earlier. So at the end of the day, there's less for security to do, there's less problems for you to have, which actually makes your workflow and makes your policy much easier to enforce. So a lot of what we've talked about today with these last couple slides is based on the GitHub flow. So GitHub flow, which many of you know from github.com, also available in GitHub Enterprise, is sort of the core tenets: collaboration, code review, commits, statuses, and feedback from other integrations that we see working. Talking again about visibility and transparency. One of the best stories I heard, I think it was just a month and a half ago. There's a team at one of the Department of Energy labs who their branch chief logs in every Friday and looks at this screen. They've replaced status reports, weekly check-ins, with the actual branch chief reviewing this screen. They can see what issues are being opened, what issues are being closed, what the velocity, what bugs are being found, how much code is actually changing, and maybe just as interestingly, who's changing the code. You know that, hey, my developer Bill or my developer Jane actually is doing 2/3 of the code coming in this week, but I know she's going on vacation for a month. She has her honeymoon and she's already put in leave. What's going to happen to my team? What's going to happen to my workflow when that happens? So not only are we surfacing, previously the project manager or branch chief would know my team is going on leave or this is going to happen, but now they're able to really see the true impacts of what that change is going to have on their organization. Super exciting for me, again, coming from a development background, coming from a government background, admittedly someone who went to a lot of meetings by the end of my tenure, being able to surface some of this information, actually getting managers involved with the day-to-day working of a team, not just involved with the status a team decides to share out, is super helpful because it really helps to raise that transparency, raise that visibility of changes throughout the organization. I also have another team within the government using GitHub who's actually looking at code at the pull request level. Now, I'm not saying that the project manager actually knows what he's looking at, but he knows when that X is red, that means their unit tests are failing. He knows when that check is green, that their unit tests and their integration tests are passing. It knows how close they are to actually deploying this code into production or meeting their release deadlines, whether it be a 2-week sprint or quarterly deployment, or in some areas of the government, a yearly or bi-yearly deployment. But they're actually able to use the tools to get into the code, get into the process, and sort of raise this visibility up. Again, I hope I'm hitting it home, but these are tools that as developers we've been using for years, right? This is what the 110 million pull requests on github.com looks like. But I really want to say that this isn't just for developers. This is for your QA teams who are able to see, you're using a code coverage tool. And it says explicitly, your code coverage of unit tests is 43%. So now your QA team is no longer the bad guy finding all the bugs. They're able to point back to the developers and say, well, we're finding all the bugs because you're not writing the tests for this. We're partners in this process. We're partners in this software development team, and you're not carrying your weight right now. One of the interesting things on this, I used this example earlier about this Probot integration with OpenShift. You see that view deployment button. That's a link. So this spun up a new set of Docker containers and deployed them out to the server. It made them addressable. Any manager, every accessibility compliance team person can log into this container and see what the product is looking like right now. That's been really helpful for one of our teams at the Department of State whose main workflow with this is actually 508 compliance. and helping to make sure that these applications, these tools, not just aren't meeting the mission requirements, but actually meeting the user requirements as well. Again, you see at the bottom as well, it says all checks have passed. A great way for a manager or team roll-up QA lead to look and see sort of how the quality of the code is at any time. Again, surfacing, making this information visible, not just to development teams or even agile development teams, but to everyone in your organization. So let's talk security for a second. So what GitHub is, so we've talked a lot about workflows, right? We've seen tools, we've seen Sentinel automatically suggesting documents to look at, teams to ping, things that managers can look at. But let's talk about how GitHub is actually making this more secure, helping you meet your compliance needs. First thing is harnessing the fire hose. We want to make all of the information available in the system available to you, available to your compliance teams, to your enterprise architects, within your existing tools. This is a really nasty screen out of Splunk from one of our customers. I don't like this screen. I'm glad I'm not having to manage this screen, but what this screen shows us is how much data we're making available to you. Not only are we logging everything that happens with the code, so everything at the Git level, we're logging everything that happens within the UI. We're logging everything that's happening with the integration. So you can see that Jenkins returned success or Jenkins returned failure. We provide a lot of charts, a lot of graphs, a lot of visibility within the application as we've just seen, but some of our most successful customers, especially as we start talking about out of government and into the startup world, SAP has written hundreds of tools that sit on top of GitHub, just reading our log data and using our API to make specific dashboards and specific views into the code that matters most to them. We have a customer who is very security conscious, use these same logs. They put it behind machine learning. Well, machine learning is such a catch-all these days. Pattern recognition may be an easier way to say it. They looked at these Git access logs, and they were able to find users who, let's say, were working routinely in 20 different projects. And then one day they started systematically downloading every other project within the organization. Or maybe you're a system admin, and you never use GitHub at all, but because you're in the organization, of course, you have single sign-on credentials to this enterprise tool. One day you started downloading 40 repositories at the same time. They use their pattern recognition tools on the back end, which they have already built because they are a security-conscious organization, to use the GitHub logs, the GitHub data made available to them, to immediately suspend this account when this action happened. Then flagged security, and security called the user within 3 minutes. So as we talk about data loss and protection, as we talk about making this data available to you, it really is a very rich set of data. I talk to customers, and they say, well, can GitHub do this for me? Do you have this feature? Often my answer is no, but we have a platform for you to build it. Because in reality, as I've worked with security and CISOs all throughout the federal government and regulated industries, no one's process, no one's tooling, no one's requirements are the exact same. So instead of us trying to build a tool that fits all, that makes all, our goal is to build a best-of-breed tool, right? That uses the integrations you're already using. If you're an enterprise that uses Splunk, great. We give you that data in syslog-ng. Or you're using Elasticsearch and other tools built into AWS. Great. You can use the syslog-ng connectors there as well. CloudWatch or whatever else it may be. Our goal isn't to try to build a product, build a tool that does all of this for you, because at the end of the day, we want your team, your security team, to be comfortable. So our goal is to give you the building blocks to integrate in this with whatever you already have. Again, we mentioned earlier identity management. This sort of thing that really gains a lot of people's interest in government is I want you to use your PIV and CAC for everything you do, right? It has the ability to not only give you two-factor authentication, it's already integrated within your organization, within SSO. And as we work further to build out more commit signing, currently GitHub includes GPG commit signing. So using pretty good privacy to certify that the person writing this commit is actually that person. As we continue to build on that, maybe introduce things like X509 commit signing. We can use the keys and the tokens and the cryptography already available to you as a government user today within the tool. Again, I mentioned data loss prevention. I gave the example of the team who sort of used our logs, used our tools to provide early warning. But let's also look at tools that people have built on top of GitHub or with GitHub to serve this in their organization. This is a tool built by AWS itself, AWS Labs. which can help to detect when you're committing AWS secrets into your code base. I guess by show of hands, anyone in this room ever had an issue where they've committed secrets, they've committed private keys, or anything else that really shouldn't be in whether it be Git, GitHub, or any other repository? How many of you are not raising your hands because you haven't done it, or not raising your hands because you don't want to admit to it? I mean, it was just last week in the news, right, where we heard another example of people using these cloud tools that are available today. Unfortunately, as they become prevalent, mistakes can happen, right? So by using tools like this Git Secrets plugin to check your commits before they actually get into your GitHub repository or your GitHub Enterprise repository, we can hope to sort of head some of these problems off before they happen. Another example is the safe commit hook. This not only looks for things like private keys, it can look for PII. Hey, it looks like you just committed a file that includes something that looks a lot like a social security number. There's 3 digits and a dash, and 2 digits and a dash, and 4 digits and a dash. Maybe that's a malformed phone number, but I don't think so. Let's go ahead and make sure you really want to do that, and I'm going to block it until you do. Or the GitHub Watchdog. This is something that was built by Jeff Fredrickson out of GSA. So one of the tools they're using in their accounts today. Building on top of the APIs, building on top of the tools we already have, and to sort of help secure, help manage your workflows. One of the things I really hope to be hitting home, and while it can be more burdensome, my goal isn't to say, yes, our policy should be we don't commit PII. Our policy is we don't commit data that can lead to life and property loss. But actually to provide you the APIs, provide you the ability to write tools, write processes that can enforce that for you. So at this point, so security's concern, well, we don't want to let you use tools that are in the cloud, whether it be AWS, or use tools like GitHub.com. Well, yes, those concerns are so valid, but you can start to lay out the policy, lay out the automation, lay out the enforcement protocol for them so that they can be more comfortable that, okay, I know we told you not to commit PII, but as security, I'm never just going to trust that telling you is actually going to do it. You've proven to me that you've actually put tools in place connected to these GitHub accounts, connected to your GitHub Enterprise, that's enforcing this for me as well. Let's identify vulnerabilities with your code. So going back again to code review, this is an example where GitHub was actually making a change to the code for pull requests itself, right? So another example from GitHub, our actual application, where one of our engineers says, to me this looks and kind of smells like it could be a SQL injection. I don't actually think it is, but the way you're writing it, the way you're not adding these checks in, you're going down that road. And while this may not be the SQL injection, it's the next person who comes along after you, or the person who comes after that, who adds one more variable that now takes it over the top. So using code review to find those sort of changes within your organization, and quite frankly, get security involved in those changes within your organization. Another example from one of our customers, they're using GitHub Enterprise as their central place of code deployment. But what they do is their only users of that actual GitHub Enterprise is their security team. They have HP Fortify hooked up to that GitHub Enterprise instance, and they're scanning all pieces of code that go in against their known vulnerabilities, their known checks, and their known policies. Previously, this happened by a dev team would do work, they'd burn it to a CD, they'd mail it to the security office, which is here in DC, and they may be all over the country. Security team would get the CD, let it sit on a desk for 3 weeks, do the scan, print out a 400-page report, likely of vulnerabilities that were introduced to the code in the 2 months it sat on their desk, right? Because OpenSSL has been updated twice since then. There's been 2 zero-day vulnerabilities that have come out that clearly haven't been patched in the code, and then mail that report back across the country. And we start this process again, right? It was a 6-month process for many of these applications to actually get approved by security and into production. They are now dropping their code in GitHub Enterprise. HP Fortify, with the same rules, same processes, is running on those commits and those pull requests, and within 5 minutes, they're getting that green check or that red X if there are problems. It's taken security approval from 6 months down to like 2.5 weeks. And this isn't even talking about developers using GitHub Enterprise and using pull requests and code review. This is just bringing the security team involvement. One of the things we're seeing in highly successful teams, security is no longer something that happens at the very end of the process. It's not like developers work for 6 months, and we're a week away from delivery, and they say, over the fence, it's yours now. No, by the way, you have to finish this in a week because this has to ship, and our branch chief has signed off on it, and we're going to announce this in an organization-wide communications. Security is now involved in the whole process. Again, that HP Fortify example, security knows exactly the state of that code on every commit, on every check-in, and they know what's happening. So using not only automated tools, but humans to help this process. Looking again at Sentinel, some of this can be automated. It was great that we had a developer on staff who knew a lot about SQL injections, and maybe they learned this the hard way by doing many themselves. But here's Sentinel pointing out something that says, hey, you're writing a regular expression and you're trying to validate something. But the way you wrote it, I'm not sure if you're really capturing everything you mean to. Maybe you are, maybe you're not, but I'm going to raise this to your attention to make sure you see it. Again, as we talk about reducing bugs, reducing processes, these are the sort of tools and integrations you can build into GitHub to make more secure code, make more transparent code. Finally, I really like to talk about status checks. We've talked about them before, the red X's and the green check marks. But this is a great example of an organization has decided these are the things that have to happen before code can actually be merged, can make it into production. Or maybe make it into our development branch, make it into our QA branch. And in this case, the code can't be merged. The code can't be brought in. How many people in this room have had concerns of, my development team or my QA team said they tested this, but I don't know if they really did? Again, I'll use my own experience. Deadlines happen, right? Bugs get found at the last minute. You make a fix to the bug, and you deploy that change. I've created bugs in those last-minute fixes of other bugs. It's happened to everyone, right? Processes are meant to be followed, but when the fire gets hot, deadlines approach, and something's broken in production, sometimes you have to take shortcuts. You can actually build those processes, build those checks into your GitHub process so that you can't take shortcuts. It's enforcing this for you. Not saying this is a bad thing for developers, because hopefully, again, everything we've talked about before is helping to reduce those vulnerabilities showing up in production, reduce those vulnerabilities and security holes being found much earlier in the process. So we've talked about security, we've talked about transparency. I do want to give you a little bit of an idea of where GitHub's going in the future, because I think this plays into how GitHub can help you modernize your own development environment, help you modernize your own processes. So it's important when we think about GitHub, we're really building for 3 different audiences, right? We're building for the developers. We want to build in functionality to the product, easier code reviews, auto-suggesting reviewers. We released yesterday the notion of nested teams, so you can have an organization structure where maybe you have an account, and then you have your orgs laid out under it, and your divisions and your branches under that, and then individual project teams, so that they can inherit resources, inherit permissions. We're developing for the developer. We're also developing for the business. Things like pre-receive hooks, things we saw with the AWS Labs Git secret, protecting against AWS keys and secrets being committed into your code. We want to make sure that your processes, your workflows can be enforced. That may not matter as much to open source teams who are just writing code, but for you as a business, for you as an enterprise, these are what allows your security teams and your managers to sleep at night. And finally, we're developing for integrators. As I mentioned, over half of our traffic to the site is coming from integrators. They're a key piece, and quite frankly, they're going to be a key piece to everyone's success going forward. I mentioned things so far with things like static code analysis, issue management, integrations with Jira, CI integrations with Jenkins and Circle CI and Travis. These are integrations that, by making them stronger, allow you to use them better. What if we could surface the logs from these tools within the GitHub UI? What if we could help identify common problems and make them speed up their test cycles, their deployment cycles? What if we could suggest optimizations and parallelizations for you automatically? We want to build on the platform and for those integrators as well. How do we do this? Keep in mind user experience. I need more than 10 fingers to count government customers who are coming from legacy tools, whether it be Subversion, whether it be something like TeamForge, or just an in-house item, where they're saying, well, we're using GitHub completely different than how we use our existing tools because the UI is different, right? We didn't used to manage issues within our tool, but now we do within GitHub because it's so easy. I had a customer last week say, My manager actually now goes and reads issues and comments on issues. They never did that in the old tool. The same reason we're able to get 20 plus million users on GitHub.com is we have a devotion to users, the user experience, UI, UX. That same sort of ability comes into your GitHub Enterprise, comes into your organization. Powered by data. I mentioned there's 110 million pull requests on GitHub.com. What if we can pull through those commit messages and say, fixed off by one error? How many off by one errors do you think we see on GitHub.com on a daily basis? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands when we get a new language like Swift released on the platform. What if we can use these sort of patterns, use these sort of code to be the Stack Overflow as your assistant, right? We showed Sentinel a minute ago, actually reading code and saying, hey, I think you did this wrong. What if we're able to use these insights, these common changes, and let internal to GitHub suggest these changes for you? We don't see GitHub writing code for you, but we see GitHub being your code assistant. We see GitHub being able to sit alongside you and maybe suggest things you didn't see or help you with common snippets you didn't know you needed. And finally, GitHub's going to empower communities. That community may be an open source community, or maybe a community within your organization. Things like graphs, things like collaboration, things like status checks are going to make it easier for your accessibility teams, your security teams, your project management teams to all work together. Finally, some best practices as we think about going forward. I mentioned we launched nested teams. There is a particular healthcare government customer who I was talking to a couple months ago who said they had something like 50 different organizations on their GitHub account. As we go forward with nested teams, I want you to be thinking more teams and team structures, not organizations. Organizations too often lead to silos. Well, again, with nested teams, you can inherit permissions and share easier. Doesn't mean you can't keep information separate. You can keep information at a need-to-know level like some of our customers do. But think about teams first, not organizations. Custom apps. Again, I gave a talk yesterday on Probot. I showed you some examples of integrating GitHub and OpenShift with Probot. Let's think about the ways you can build stronger integrations that, that sort of lock in your workflow, lock in your process within your tools, not adding additional tools to the workflow. And finally, as I mentioned with teams, think interoperability, don't think silos. One of our other GitHub Enterprise customers, they had deployed GitHub Enterprise for about 4 months. CIO stood up in front of the room in one of their monthly stand-ups and said, we've had our first success with GitHub Enterprise this month. The answer wasn't that they had successfully onboarded their 30th team or project. It wasn't that their largest team in their organization had come on board. It's that now 2 of their teams were sharing code and fixing bugs together because they were using a similar identity component. It's that interoperability, it's that ability to work together that sort of makes modern development, that makes modern workflows possible. So as we as a government think about things, we can still lock things down, but we should also think about why are we locking things down and what are we losing when we lock things down. So with that, again, you can find me online. Always reach us at government@github.com or our government website, government.github.com. But we do have about 8 minutes left. So we've talked about a bunch of things, transparency, visibility, even what's coming with GitHub. I want to open the floor to Q&A if anyone has any questions. I have a question. Oh, there we go. Yep.
I noticed that Amazon's IAM wasn't represented on that slide.
Yep.
When I was looking at your slide with
Right.
respect to identity management,
Yep.
one thing that was notably missing to me was Amazon's IAM. Does GitHub integrate with that?
So we integrate with all SAML 2.0 providers, which I think Amazon's IAM is at this point. However, what I've actually found with on-the-ground experience is most of our customers are only provisioning users in IAM at the administrator level or the infrastructure level, and you're not seeing full visibility inside the organization with IAM accounts. Again, as I start talking about accessibility teams, security teams, project managers, not all of them today typically have IAM accounts. So typically it's the Enterprise Active Directory, the Enterprise Okta, whatever it may be, that we're seeing the better usage of enterprise-wide credentials. But there's no reason you couldn't integrate it with IAM.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Other questions? Over here.
How is GitHub for Government different from non-government GitHub?
So our GitHub for Government microsite really is not, so there is no special product GitHub for Government. The GitHub for Government microsite, and this is a question I get all the time, we don't explain it quite well on our website, is GitHub can meet these sort of compliance requirements. As I mentioned, like PIV and CAC, FSMA compliance, have been working recently with teams at the FDA and their security teams on what controls they need to meet and how GitHub meets them. It's just an attempt to try to call out many of these controls, many of these common questions, and answer them for you so you can sort of come loaded with these answers when you start proposing this to leadership or security or whoever it may be. But there is no actual separate product. Other questions? For those who are left, real quick, by show of hands, how many of you are using tools like Subversion or ClearCase within your organization today? Yeah? How many of you are using plain Git? Not GitHub, not GitLab, not Bitbucket, just have a Git servers running somewhere? Yeah, still more hands. How many of you are using enterprise integrations, maybe again HP Fortify, SonarQube, or Jira, but manually copying code around, manually shipping CDs across the country, or bringing CDs around your organization, and they're not integrated into your end user tools? Yeah. So these are all changes. These are things we see super common within the government. So hopefully, at least I've shown you today that there is a path forward to sort of integrate some of these processes going forward and improve this workflow as much as you can. So again, I appreciate everyone's time today. I'm sticking around for most of us today. You can find me at the GitHub booth. If nothing else, find a bunch of stickers at the GitHub booth. Thank you again.